You ever wake up in a place so beautiful, so pristine, so impossibly expensive that it feels like a museum? That's my morning. Every single day. I live in a penthouse that most people would kill for. Floor-to-ceiling windows that make the city feel like it's mine, sleek marble countertops that are cold under my fingers, and a walk-in closet that could house a small family. Everything here screams power, success, and independence. And yet, for all the space, it's empty. No one ever calls to check in. No family visits. No warm Sunday dinners. Just me, my coffee, and the city skyline. I'm Jessica Carter, senior manager at one of the most powerful firms in the country. I built my career from the ground up, not because I had to, but because I knew no one in my family would ever hand me anything. Unlike my mother, Margaret, who social climbed her way into influence, or my sister, Emily, who was born into it and never let me forget it, I actually worked for what I have. And I love what I do. Most mornings start the same way. Black coffee, news updates on my tablet, and silence. No good morning texts from family. No lingering phone calls checking in on me. Just the rhythmic ticking of the clock on my wall, reminding me that in the Carter family, you're either useful or you're invisible. It wasn't always this way. There was a time I fought for their approval. A time when I tried so hard to belong at those glittering dinner parties, to be someone Margaret could proudly introduce as her daughter. But no matter what I did, I was always the other one. The less glamorous sister. The one who worked instead of lunching at exclusive clubs. The one who wasn't invited to certain family meetings because my energy didn't match the brand. I let it go. Or at least, I tell myself I did. But Margaret and Emily? They never let it go. They hate that I don't need them. That I don't beg to be part of their world. That I succeeded without them. And that hate? Oh, they wear it like a designer handbag, expensive, cruel, and entirely on display when they think I'm not looking. Today, though, the silence feels heavier. There's something in the air, something waiting to tip the balance. I can feel it, humming underneath the usual stillness. I just don't know yet that my family is about to make one final attempt to push me out for good. And this time, they're going to regret it. The thing about the Carter family is that everything looks perfect from the outside. The money, the influence, the carefully curated public image, it all screams power and success. But if you step a little closer, past the glitz and the carefully staged photo shoots, you'll see the cracks. And those cracks? They're deep. I learned a long time ago that in my family, loyalty is transactional. You're only valuable if you're playing by their rules. And I stopped playing a long time ago. That's why, when I saw my mother's name flash across my phone screen that afternoon, I hesitated. Margaret Carter didn't just call me. She summoned. And if she was reaching out, it meant one thing: she needed something. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Jessica, dear, I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how to pick up a phone. Margaret's voice was the same as always, polished, clipped, vaguely disapproving. Mother, I said, sipping my coffee. To what do I owe the pleasure? There was a pause, just long enough for me to picture the way her perfectly manicured nails were probably drumming against some overpriced surface in irritation. We're going to Italy for a few weeks, she said finally, her voice smooth as glass. It's been far too long since the family traveled together. I assume you'll clear your schedule. I let out a short laugh. She had to be joking. Yeah, that's not happening. Another pause. I could almost hear the tightening of her jaw. Jessica, don't be difficult. This isn't a request. There it was, the command. The expectation that I would fall in line, that I would snap to attention because Margaret Carter had spoken. I have a job, Mother, I said, keeping my tone deliberately cool. Unlike Emily, I don't have the luxury of dropping everything for a shopping spree across Europe. Jessica, darling, a new voice cut in, dripping with faux sweetness. Emily. Of course, she was listening in. You work too much, she continued, her voice full of manufactured concern. That's why you always look so tense. I clenched my jaw. Emily and I had never been close, but she had a talent for passive-aggressive digs that rivaled even our mothers. I look tense because I have responsibilities, I shot back. Something you wouldn't understand. Margaret sighed dramatically. Must you always make things so unpleasant? We're inviting you because we're family. You do still consider yourself a Carter, don't you? There it was. The veiled threat. The reminder that, in their eyes, my existence outside their world was conditional. I stared out at the city skyline, my fingers drumming against my desk. Fine, I said finally. I'll go. The words tasted bitter, but something told me I needed to see this through. Margaret's tone brightened instantly. Wonderful. We'll be taking the jet, of course. I assume you'll meet us at the airport. Of course, I murmured, already regretting my decision. That evening, I found myself at my parents' estate, a sprawling mansion that felt more like a luxury hotel than a home. The dining room was exactly as I remembered it, cold. Beautiful, but cold. Crystal chandeliers, an impossibly long table set with bone china, and an air so thick with unspoken tension you could choke on it. Margaret sat at the head of the table, poised as ever, a glass of wine in hand. Emily sat beside her, scrolling through her phone, looking bored. My father, Robert Carter, was also present, though he might as well have been furniture for all the impact he had on the room. Jessica, he greeted me with a polite nod. Dad, I responded, just as stiffly. Robert Carter was a powerful CEO, but when it came to family matters, he was absent. Always buried in work, always conveniently looking the other way when Margaret and Emily made it clear that I wasn't one of them. As I took my seat, I noticed the slight smirk on Emily's face. That wasn't a good sign. So, Jessica, she said, resting her chin on her hand. Are you excited for Italy? I can't wait, I deadpanned. Margaret ignored my sarcasm, sipping her wine. We'll be attending several exclusive events while we're there. It's a wonderful networking opportunity. You should be grateful. There was always a should when it came to Margaret. I should be grateful. I should be more like Emily. I should try harder to fit into the picture-perfect image of the Carter family. I said nothing. Emily, of course, couldn't help herself. You know, Mother was considering taking someone else in your place, she said, eyes gleaming with barely concealed amusement. But she decided to be generous. I looked between them, something sharp settling in my chest. This wasn't a vacation. It was a test. A chance for Margaret to remind me that I was only allowed into the Carter inner circle when it suited them. I should have told them to go to hell. Instead, I smiled. How thoughtful, I said smoothly, matching Emily's tone. I so appreciate your generosity. Margaret studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a satisfied nod. Good. Now, let's discuss the itinerary. That night, as I drove back to my penthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Margaret didn't do anything without a reason. Emily never let an opportunity for cruelty pass her by. They wanted me on this trip. Not because they wanted me there, but because they wanted to remind me that I didn't belong. I had no idea just how far they were willing to go to prove it. But soon, I'd find out. And so would the entire world. I should have known something was off when I arrived at the airport and found no sign of my family. No driver. No assistants fussing over last-minute details. No Margaret and Emily parading through first-class check-in, dripping in designer labels and self-importance. Just me, standing alone with my luggage, in a place where I clearly wasn't expected. I checked my phone. Nothing. No messages, no itinerary updates. My flight confirmation email? Missing. My reservation in the airline system? Non-existent. I walked up to the counter, keeping my voice calm. Hi, I should have a ticket for the Carter family's flight. Jessica Carter. The airline agent, a young woman with tired eyes and an apologetic smile, tapped at her keyboard. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see a booking under your name. I exhaled sharply. That's not possible. I was told my ticket was booked under the family reservation. She tried again, clicking through different screens. Then she glanced at me, her face shifting from polite professionalism to something like pity. The Carter family does have a reservation, she confirmed slowly. But your name isn't on the list. I blinked. No, they wouldn't. Would they? I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother. Straight to voicemail. Emily? Voicemail. I tried my father. Not because I thought he'd help, he probably didn't even know what was going on, but because I needed someone in that family to pick up. Nothing. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. They had left me behind on purpose. Margaret and Emily had planned this. Set me up. I could practically hear Emily's delighted laughter, the way she would retell this later over champagne, painting it as some sort of cruel inside joke. Oh, Jessica? Yes, she was supposed to come. But you know how she is, always so distracted with work. She must have mixed up the dates. I gripped the counter, inhaling deeply to keep my expression neutral. Would you like to book another ticket? The airline agent asked hesitantly. Another ticket? Because my family abandoned me on purpose and now I had to pay to follow them? No, absolutely not. Actually, I said, forcing a smile, I think I'll pass. The moment I turned away, I heard a voice, quiet, hesitant. Miss Carter. I looked up to see a young airport employee, maybe early 20s, barely old enough to drink, standing a few feet away, his phone in his hand. He hesitated. I work here, but I saw what just happened. That was your family, right? I studied him carefully. Why? I asked. He swallowed. Because I recorded it. My stomach dropped. You what? I know that sounds bad, he rushed to explain. But I was already filming because, well, they're the Carters. Your mom and sister, everyone knows who they are. And I saw them at check-in, talking about their flight, and then he stopped himself. I didn't mean to intrude, but when you walked up to the counter and they ignored you, He trailed off, looking guilty. I'm really sorry, but it's already online. I blinked. Excuse me? He winced. It kind of went viral. I grabbed my phone and pulled up social media. Sure enough, there it was. A video posted just 20 minutes ago, already exploding with likes and shares. The footage started with Margaret and Emily at the check-in counter, smiling and chatting with the airline staff. Then the camera panned as I walked up to the desk. The agent pulled up the reservation. Told me I wasn't on the list. The camera zoomed in on my face just as the realization dawned. Then, and this was the part that made my blood run cold, the camera caught Emily watching me from a distance. She knew. She had waited to see my reaction. And then, in the final seconds of the video, she smirked. The caption? Rich family ditches daughter at the airport. Damn. Skull, skull, skull. I scrolled through the comments, my heart pounding. Did they just straight up abandon her? Imagine getting left behind by your own mother. The way the sister smirks at the end? That's some movie villain **T. These people are literal demons. Oh, this is going to be a PR nightmare for them. The last one made me pause. Because they were right. Margaret Carter was a woman obsessed with appearances. She had spent decades building an image of wealth, influence, perfection. And now, in the span of a single 20-second clip, that image was shattering. I looked back up at the airport employee, whose face was shifting between excitement and horror. I probably should have asked before posting, huh? He said weakly. For the first time since this disaster started, I smiled. No, I said. You did exactly the right thing. By the time I got home, my phone was blowing up. News outlets were picking up the story. Blogs were dissecting every second of the footage. Comment sections were on fire. People were furious. Not just at my mother and sister, but at the entire Carter family. It wasn't just some petty socialite drama. It was a public betrayal, a clear, undeniable moment of cruelty caught on camera. And people weren't letting it slide. By the time the news reached morning talk shows, Margaret's PR team was in full-blown damage control mode. Too late. The narrative had already escaped their control. The next morning, my phone rang. Margaret. I let it ring twice before answering. Mother, I said smoothly. How was the flight? A sharp inhale. Then, you need to issue a statement. I almost laughed. Do I? This is an embarrassment, Jessica. We need to fix this. You will tell the press that there was a mix-up. That you were late, that you misunderstood. I cut her off. No. Silence. Then, she tried a different tactic. Jessica, be reasonable. Do you think this kind of attention is good for you? I smiled. It's fantastic for me, actually. Another beat of silence. Then, for the first time in my life, I heard something in Margaret Carter's voice that almost sounded like fear. Jessica, she said slowly, what are you planning to do? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the city skyline. You'll see. And for the first time, I knew I had them exactly where I wanted them. Margaret Carter had always been untouchable. She built her life around control over her image, her social circle, her carefully curated family brand. Every gala she attended, every interview she gave, every Instagram-worthy vacation she orchestrated, it was all a performance designed to maintain the illusion of the perfect Carter dynasty. And now, that illusion was in flames. The video of my airport humiliation had spiraled into something bigger than any of us. People weren't just talking about the Carter family betraying their own daughter, they were digging. Old rumors. Hidden scandals. Backdoor deals. Reporters were sniffing around. Social media was relentless. Brands were pulling sponsorships. Margaret and Emily had always relied on their connections to control the narrative, but this time, the narrative had slipped out of their hands and straight into the public's fury. And I was done playing defense. The morning after my mother's frantic phone call, I woke up to 4 missed calls from an unknown number. I ignored them. Then, at 9 a.m. sharp, my building's concierge called. Miss Carter, a man named David White is in the lobby. He says he's your father's legal counsel. I blinked. David White. My father's lawyer. Not my mother's. That got my attention. I told the concierge to send him up. David White was already seated in my penthouse living room when I walked in, a leather briefcase at his feet, looking every bit the part of a high-powered corporate attorney. I crossed my arms. David, to what do I owe the pleasure? He stood, adjusting his tie. Jessica, I'm here on behalf of your father. That was interesting. Robert Carter had spent my entire life avoiding confrontation. If he was sending his personal legal counsel to speak to me, something was very, very wrong. David cleared his throat. I assume you're aware of the crisis currently surrounding your family? I smirked. Oh, you mean the one where my mother and sister publicly humiliated me at an international airport, and now the world is watching their empire burn? Yeah, I'm caught up. David exhaled through his nose. I'll get to the point. There's something you need to know about Carter Global Holdings. My stomach tightened. What about it? He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. 20 years ago, Robert Carter established a trust in your name. At the time, you were a minor, so the details were kept confidential. Your father assumed you'd be brought into the company eventually, so he set aside a percentage of shares in a long-term trust, intended to mature when you turned 35. I frowned, flipping through the documents. Why are you telling me this now? David hesitated. Because of your mother. Of course. He leaned forward. Margaret and Emily have been mismanaging company funds for years. Robert has always looked the other way, but with the current media backlash, the board is panicking. Investors are questioning leadership. Your mother's influence is unraveling. I stared at him. And what does this have to do with me? David tapped the document. Your father never told anyone, but thanks to the trust, you are now the largest shareholder in Carter Global. I stopped breathing. What? David nodded. As of this moment, you own 51% of the company. The weight of that revelation hit me like a freight train. For years, Margaret and Emily had treated me like an outsider, like I was nothing compared to them. And all this time, I was the one with the power. I swallowed hard. Why didn't my father ever tell me this? David sighed. He assumed you'd never be interested. And, to be frank, Margaret always had a stronger grip on company affairs. She made sure you were never involved. Until now, I murmured. David sat back, watching me carefully. Jessica, the company is on the verge of a full-blown PR crisis. The board is considering removing your mother and sister from leadership positions. Investors are already pulling out. They need a stable figure to step in and reassure the market. I shook my head, laughing under my breath. Margaret had spent decades crafting her perfect kingdom. And now, thanks to her own cruelty, she was about to lose everything. David hesitated. The board wants you to take over. My heart pounded. They want me to be CEO? Yes. Effective immediately. Holy shit. An hour later, my phone rang. Margaret. I answered, already smiling. Jessica, she snapped, her voice sharp with barely controlled rage. What the hell do you think you're doing? I leaned back on my couch, enjoying this so much. You mean the company? I said lightly. Oh, mother. I thought you'd be proud of me. Didn't you always say I should take a more active role in the family business? You listened to me, she hissed. You have no idea what you're stepping into. Really? I mused. Because according to the 51% stake I just inherited, I think I have a pretty damn good idea. The silence on the other end was delicious. Then, quietly, she asked, Did your father tell you? I grinned. No. Your lawyer did. Apparently, you've been robbing the company blind for years. How embarrassing. Margaret inhaled sharply. Jessica, we can fix this. If you publicly support the family, we can control the damage. We'll make this go away. I tilted my head. Oh, mother, I said mockingly. For years, you made it clear I wasn't one of you. That I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or Carter enough to be part of your perfect little empire. I let the words hang in the air. Well, I guess that empire belongs to me now. Margaret exhaled sharply, her composure slipping. Jessica, don't do this. Oh, I'm not doing anything, mother, I said, relishing every second. I'm simply stepping into the role that's been mine all along. Silence. Then, in the coldest voice I'd ever heard, Margaret whispered, You'll regret this. I smiled. We'll see. And then I hung up. Margaret and Emily had spent their entire lives believing I was beneath them. Now, they were about to learn the hard way. I wasn't just their equal. I was their boss. I remember the day I first realized that everything was about to change was not marked by fireworks or dramatic music, but by a quiet email from my father's legal counsel, David White, that contained a single sentence. We need to discuss an urgent matter regarding your major shareholder status. It was the moment when I truly understood that the seeds of my vindication had been planted long ago, and now the truth was coming to fruition in the boardroom. In the weeks following that email, I immersed myself in gathering every shred of evidence I could find, combing through decades-old financial statements, internal memos, and recorded conversations that finally exposed the financial misconduct of my mother and sister. I was determined not only to prove my own capability, but also to dismantle the toxic legacy that had shadowed my every step, and to use the evidence to leverage an unprecedented corporate takeover that would leave no doubt about my rightful place at the helm. Every night after the long, solitary hours at my penthouse office, I would review documents with an intensity that bordered on obsession, piecing together the intricate puzzle of how my family had deliberately undermined my role in the company. The evidence was damning: hidden transactions, fraudulent expense reimbursements, and covert financial maneuvers designed to shift wealth away from me and secure a path for my mother and sister's self-serving ambitions. With each new document, my resolve grew stronger and my strategy more precise. I realized that I had not only become the primary victim of their betrayal, but also their ultimate weakness, and that by exposing their misdeeds publicly, I could force the board to reconsider the power dynamics that had long been in their favor. I immediately contacted a highly respected public relations firm known for its prowess in managing corporate crises and orchestrating image restoration campaigns for companies facing similar scandals. I knew that the board's reputation and the integrity of our corporate governance were at stake, And so I worked closely with the PR team to craft a meticulously detailed narrative that would not only expose my family's misconduct, but also underscore my vision for the company's future. We developed press releases, internal communications, and even a series of behind-the-scenes interviews that would be shared with influential business publications. Every piece of communication was carefully coordinated, emphasizing my long history of independent success as a senior manager, my unyielding commitment to ethical leadership, and the fact that the trust established in the company decades ago, an overlooked clause in the trust documents, had ultimately positioned me as the rightful successor. I wanted every stakeholder, from the rank-and-file employee to the most discerning investor, to understand that this was not just a family feud, but a turning point in corporate governance that would lead to a more transparent and accountable future. At our first major board meeting after the scandal broke, I walked into the room with a calm determination, knowing that every word I spoke would be scrutinized not only by the board members, but also by the media and industry analysts. I delivered a detailed presentation outlining the financial evidence I had gathered, the internal corruption that had been systematically covered up, and the strategic errors that had allowed my family to manipulate the company's finances. I spoke for what felt like hours, using measured, confident language that left no doubt about the legitimacy of my claims. I explained how, 20 years ago, my father had set up a trust that inadvertently made me the major shareholder, a fact that had been deliberately obscured by the family's scheming, and how I now had the legal and moral right to lead the company into a new era. Every statistic, every chart, every documented conversation reinforced the message that the board had been complicit in allowing unethical behavior to persist, and that it was time for a radical change. The board's reaction was mixed. Some members, who had long harbored doubts about the family's influence, expressed support and admiration for my resolve, while others were visibly uncomfortable with the implications of my revelations. It was during the subsequent days that I began to see the cracks in their once impenetrable facade. As media outlets picked up the story and the public backlash against my mother and sister grew exponentially, the pressure on the board increased, and even those who had been hesitant began to reconsider their positions. I held private meetings with key board members, patiently explaining my vision for a future built on transparency and ethical leadership, and reminding them that the company's reputation and long-term viability were far more important than maintaining a facade of familial unity that was, in reality, steeped in corruption. I also ensured that my PR campaign was not just an external operation. I made it a point to personally engage with employees at every level of the company. I organized town hall meetings and small group sessions in which I shared the details of the scandal, my vision for the company's future, and, most importantly, a heartfelt promise that I would lead with integrity, accountability, and a genuine respect for every team member. It was important for me that the employees understand that this takeover was not about revenge, but about restoring faith in a company that had long been tarnished by the misuse of power. Their enthusiastic support began to tip the scales, and soon, whispers of dissent against the family's continued control turned into vocal demands for change. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once the board realized that the evidence was irrefutable and that public opinion was firmly against my mother and sister. A high-profile shareholder meeting was scheduled, and it quickly became clear that the tide had turned in my favor. I presented my case again in front of a large group of shareholders, explaining in clear, unambiguous terms how the fraudulent activities had not only compromised the company's financial integrity, but had also directly contributed to decisions that had harmed both employees and investors alike. My arguments were bolstered by expert testimony from forensic accountants and legal advisors, who confirmed that the financial irregularities were not mere accounting errors, but deliberate acts of deception. I demonstrated that the board's failure to act against these irregularities was a breach of fiduciary duty, and I urged every shareholder to vote in favor of my proposal for a complete board overhaul and for my appointment as the new CEO. After several tense hours of deliberation, the board vote was held, and I remember feeling a mixture of relief and vindication as the final tally revealed a decisive majority in favor of my leadership. The vote was a clear repudiation of the old guard and their corrupt practices, and it signaled a new chapter for the company, one in which accountability, transparency, and merit would guide every decision. Even though the fallout was immediate and severe for my mother and sister, who soon faced legal consequences and public disgrace, I felt no personal triumph in their downfall. Instead, I was driven by the knowledge that I had not only proven my own worth, but had also set the stage for a more ethical and sustainable future for our company. In the weeks that followed, I worked tirelessly to implement sweeping changes that reformed the company's internal controls, revamped the board structure to include a majority of independent directors, and introduced rigorous new policies for financial reporting and corporate governance. I engaged with industry analysts, appeared on several business news programs, and even lectured at a prestigious business school about the importance of ethical leadership and the perils of nepotism in corporate America. The transformation was not instantaneous, and there were many long nights filled with strategic planning sessions and difficult conversations, but every challenge only reaffirmed my commitment to leading the company with unwavering integrity. Now, as I prepare for my first major board meeting as the new CEO, I feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility, tempered by the lessons learned from years of isolation and adversity. I have transformed not only my own destiny, but also that of the company, turning betrayal into an opportunity for reinvention. I continue to stand by the principles of transparency and ethical leadership, fully aware that the journey ahead will demand continual vigilance and courage, yet confident that together with a newly inspired workforce and a reformed board, we can rebuild a company that not only excels financially, but also stands as a beacon of integrity in an industry too often marred by scandal and corruption. 1 year. It had been 1 year since I walked into that boardroom and took control of the company my family never wanted me to have. 1 year since Margaret and Emily were exposed for their financial misconduct. 1 year since my mother, the ever-dominant matriarch, had been forced to fade into the background, her reputation reduced to whispers at high society luncheons. 1 year since my sister, Emily, had been removed from any position of power, her once glamorous life now defined by scandal and legal battles. And yet, as I sat in my glass-walled office on the top floor of Carter Global's headquarters, the city skyline stretching endlessly before me, I couldn't bring myself to feel victorious. I had won, but at what cost? Under my leadership, Carter Global had transformed. Profits were up. Employee morale was at an all-time high. Our once shaky reputation had been repaired, not through empty PR tactics, but through real, tangible changes. I had eliminated the culture of nepotism and corruption that Margaret and Emily had nurtured for years, instead promoting talent based on merit. For the first time in decades, Carter Global was seen as an innovator, not just a playground for the elite. The stock prices reflected that shift. The moment I took over, there was uncertainty. Investors didn't know what to make of me. But I proved them wrong. Every quarter that passed saw steady growth, and soon, analysts were calling it a miraculous recovery. I surrounded myself with real leaders, not socialites, not puppets controlled by my mother, but visionaries who actually understood business. I rebuilt trust with clients, introduced ethical investment strategies, and cut ties with the shady dealings my family had previously engaged in. The employees who had once been overlooked were now given real opportunities, and their loyalty to the company deepened. In every measurable way, I had succeeded. Yet, the ghosts of my past still lingered. Margaret Carter was no longer the force she once was. After being exposed for her financial misconduct, she had been exiled from the social circles she once ruled. The scandal had been too public, too humiliating. Even her most powerful friends had distanced themselves, unwilling to be tainted by her disgrace. At first, she fought back. She tried to spin the story, to paint herself as a victim of an internal power struggle, but no one bought it. She had built her entire empire on perception, and now that perception had shattered beyond repair. She stopped attending events, stopped making grand appearances, The last time I had seen her name in the press was months ago, in a small, desperate attempt to regain some influence. It had failed. I knew she was still in the city, still living in that massive estate that now felt far too large for just one person. From what I had heard, the once bustling mansion was now eerily quiet, the staff reduced to just a handful of people. But she would never reach out to me. Not after everything. Margaret Carter would rather die than admit defeat. Emily, on the other hand, was not so lucky. While Margaret had managed to fade away into obscurity, Emily had gone down kicking and screaming. When her financial crimes were revealed, she had denied everything. She had hired an army of lawyers, tried to blame her accountants, tried to claim ignorance. But the evidence was overwhelming. She had been removed from every board seat, every company position, every cushy high society role she had once held. The world that had once worshipped her now watched her fall with amusement. The lawsuits had piled up. Investors who had lost money due to her reckless spending sued her for damages. Former employees who had been silenced under her rule came forward with stories of mistreatment and fraud. Her accounts had been frozen. Her assets had been seized. And the final blow? The luxury penthouse she had once bragged about was no longer hers. Sold off to cover legal costs. I had heard rumors that she was hiding out in a smaller apartment, far away from the glamorous life she once knew. The same woman who had once mocked me for being too independent was now struggling to survive without the family wealth she had relied on her entire life. I should have felt satisfied, but all I felt was emptiness. The only person who had managed to walk away from the chaos unscathed was my father, Robert Carter. He had retired quietly, distancing himself from the scandal, as he always did. For years, he had been a passive observer, letting Margaret and Emily run unchecked while he focused on business. And now, in his final years, he had chosen peace. We rarely spoke, but when we did, there was a strange understanding between us. He never apologized outright, never admitted that he had failed me as a father, but in his own way, he acknowledged it. At one point, after everything had settled, he sent me a simple message. "You did what I never had the courage to do. I hope you make something better out of this company than we did." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I would ever get. As Carter Global flourished under my leadership, opportunities arose that I never expected. I had been invited to speak at one of the top business schools in the country, an institution that had once celebrated my family's success without ever acknowledging my existence. The topic? Ethical leadership in family businesses. The irony was not lost on me. Standing at the front of the auditorium, facing a crowd of students who looked at me with admiration instead of dismissal, I realized something profound. For years, I had fought to prove my worth to my family. Now, I didn't need their validation anymore. Later that night, as I stood in my office, reflecting on how far I had come, my phone buzzed. I stared at the screen, my heart steady, unshaken. A year ago, I would have answered immediately, desperate for her approval. Now, I let it ring. And then, without hesitation, I pressed ignore. It was over. I had won, not because I had taken everything from them, but because I no longer needed anything from them at all. The river stretched wide before me, its surface shimmering under the early morning light. The city was waking up behind me, cars honking, hurried footsteps tapping against the pavement, the low murmur of people moving through their lives. But here, by the water, it was quiet. The kind of quiet I had spent my whole life chasing, never quite able to find. I had won. Carter Global was thriving, the board was stronger than ever, and our stock had reached record highs. Employees were finally being valued for their work, not their connections, and investors who had once doubted me were now praising my leadership. Everything I had fought for, everything I had been denied for years, was now mine. And yet, as I stood there, the crisp morning air filling my lungs, I felt something unexpected. Not the sharp, triumphant relief of revenge, not the satisfaction of watching Margaret and Emily fall from grace. No, this was something softer, something calmer. The weight that I had carried for so long, the desperate need to prove myself, the endless chase for validation from a family that never truly saw me, it was gone. For the first time in my life, I was free. Margaret Carter was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. After months of silence, after being shunned from the social circles she once controlled, after watching her carefully built empire crumble at the hands of the very daughter she had cast aside, she did something unexpected. She showed up at my office. I had just wrapped up a meeting when my assistant hesitantly knocked on my door, her voice laced with uncertainty. "Jessica, your mother is here." I could have ignored her, could have told security to escort her out, could have left her standing in the lobby like an outsider in my world, the way she had left me at that airport. Instead, I nodded. "Send her in." Margaret entered with the same elegance she had always carried, her posture perfect, her clothes immaculate. But she looked smaller. There was no entourage, no photographers waiting outside, no Emily clinging to her side. Just her, standing in front of me, stripped of everything but her pride. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, she spoke. "You didn't return my call." I leaned back in my chair, fingers tapping idly against my desk. "No, I didn't." A flicker of irritation crossed her face, but she swallowed it down. "You've made quite the name for yourself." I smiled, tilting my head slightly. "You sound surprised." She exhaled through her nose, glancing around the office, taking in the sleek furniture, the awards on the shelves, the framed newspaper articles praising my leadership. "This was never supposed to be yours," she said, almost absently. I didn't flinch. And yet, here we are. Margaret's fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. "I know you think you've won, Jessica. And in some ways, you have. But power is fleeting. One scandal, one bad quarter, one wrong move." I cut her off, my voice steady. "I know how fragile power is, Mother. The difference between us is that I don't need it to define me." That made her pause. For so long, I had wanted something from her. Approval, acknowledgement, an apology. But now, looking at her, all I saw was a woman who had spent her whole life trying to control everything and had ended up with nothing. Margaret Carter had built an empire, and I had taken it from her. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because it was never really hers to begin with. She must have seen the finality in my eyes, because after a long silence, she straightened her shoulders, smoothing down the front of her blazer like it was armor. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "I never hated you, Jessica." I raised an eyebrow. Could have fooled me. She looked away for a moment, something almost like regret flickering across her face. "You reminded me too much of myself." For the first time, I felt something shift. Margaret Carter had never been a mother to me. She had been a force, a storm, a ruler in a kingdom I had never been welcome in. But hearing those words, hearing her admit that she had seen herself in me, was the closest thing to an explanation I would ever get. I didn't need more than that. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need her. She must have sensed it, because she gave me one last, long look before nodding slightly. "I suppose this is goodbye then." I exhaled. "I suppose it is." And then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Later that evening, I found myself standing by the river again, the water reflecting the glow of the city lights. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen. A message from my assistant. "The board is ready for tomorrow's meeting. Would you like to review the agenda?" I smiled to myself, typing a quick response. "No need. I'm ready." For years, I had walked into rooms desperate to prove that I belonged, that I was worthy, that I was a Carter. But I didn't care about that anymore. I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing this for me. And as I stood there, the cool breeze tugging at my hair, the weight of my past finally lifted from my shoulders, I knew one thing for certain. I had spent my whole life chasing my family's approval. Now, I was leading without it. And that was the greatest victory of all.